It's now my great pleasure to introduce our fourth speaker for this morning. Our next speaker is Neil Linscheid from the University of Minnesota. Neil is an extension educator at the University of Minnesota, the Extension Center for Community Vitality. And if you have a chance, I really encourage you to visit their website. The Extension Center for Community Vitality does some really great work in multiple areas relevant to rural communities, including entrepreneurship, local economic development, business succession planning, community leadership, tourism, and as a data clearinghouse. So thank you, Neil, very much for being here today. And wow, changing the rural narrative. I think the Deputy Governor was trying to make the case that we can change the narrative. And so thank you for being here to sort of build on the Deputy Governor's comments.
Well, it is certainly my pleasure to be here. And I was really excited to hear the comments this morning because they definitely fit into what I'll be talking about today. And that is about rewriting the rural narrative. But first, we'll have to talk about what that narrative is and why it matters and what you think about it. I think before I get started into some of those remarks, I just want to tell you where I'm coming from, since you may not know me and I'm from a state far away. As was mentioned, I work for University of Minnesota Extension, but what that doesn't tell you is that I also live in a small community, and that I have spent several years in the community before I moved on the city council, a town of about 850 people. I served on the city council, was acting mayor for a little while, was involved in the Economic Development Authority, Community Foundation. My journey to living and working with small towns and thinking about the future of small towns really did start, though, at the University of Minnesota Morris, where I worked at a group called the Center for Small Towns. And I had no idea about what it was like to live in a small town. I grew up in the Twin Cities metro area, so St. Paul and Minneapolis, in a really pretty urban neighborhood. I went out to Morris because I liked to be able to see the stars at night and not just streetlight glow. And when I got there, I just happened upon a work-study job that allowed me to help communities. I was interested in just doing something useful. And we did community surveys, we did research projects, things like that. And that's where I learned about more about what it's like to live and work and be part of a small town community. And that's really where I was involved many years ago in a research project that looked at how the metro media in the state of Minnesota portrayed rural Minnesota. And it was sort of a ridiculous project at the time. I was reading 2,000 newspaper articles about rural Hennepin County, which, if you know anything about Minnesota, that's really the county where Minneapolis, our largest city, is located, and how there was some sort of accident in rural Hennepin County, really just implying that there was like a farm or something nearby. So that was the rural place. Read articles about, there was a terrible murder or some other terrible event that happened in a small town. And now the sleepy residents of that community are locking their doors and they're waking up to the real world or something like that. It was sort of a constant stream of articles, and you start to see that there is a storyline, that there's a way that people talk about our small towns. And in books and articles in the national media, but even books written by folks from rural places, we see some of these same stories that my colleague and I, Ben, we started talking about this as the narrative. What is this narrative? What is this thing? And for me, this was new. I kind of liked living in a small town. I thought it was great. I wanted to live there. But I would see things like The Decline of Rural Minnesota. Maybe you have the same book on your shelf, The Decline of Rural Illinois, or you got to fight for survival. hollowing out the middle was popular a few years ago, but really it doesn't go a year where we don't see some story about how small communities and rural places are just on the edge of death. And well, what does that narrative sort of look like? It's something like there's a brain drain. All our best and brightest are leaving. We live in the middle of nowhere. We're sleepy. We don't live in the real world. Everyone knows each other. Nobody locks their doors. Maybe it's Norman Rockwell paintings personified in real life. But usually it's about what we had. What we don't have, what we wish we had, what we could have had. It's nostalgic. I mean, where does this come from, though? It's odd. Maybe it comes from the changes that have happened. I mean, over many of our lifetimes, and some that are our grandparents' lifetimes, agriculture has mechanized. Roads and transportation systems have been built and become extremely efficient. Our main streets have restructured and turned over multiple times. Schools have consolidated, churches have consolidated. But I mean, do all of these mean that we're dying? Do they mean that we have nothing to offer in these places? What we talk about in Minnesota with others, and what I want to talk about with you today, is that rural places are changing, they're not dying. And that in the midst of many of those changes I just showed you, there's a story of transformation, adaptability, and the ability to plan for the future, to think about what's next, to look at the assets that we have in our communities and find ways to make them into positive futures for ourselves. And I want to share just some data to help make this case. So if you're allergic to data, maybe just turn down the volume and check out a YouTube video or something for a little while. We'll be back to the fun, emotional stuff, but let's talk about the data. So if you think about one story, it's that whenever the census comes out, we talk about how the number of people, the rural population has declined. And often what's missed in that discussion is that it's usually about the share of people living in rural places that has declined. So since 1970, the rural population, the number of people living in rural places has increased by 11%. But the relative percentage, how big our piece of the pie in rural places might be, has declined. But our country has grown. We have more people living in rural places. Some towns are actually very desirable. They're so desirable that they get reclassified as they grow. If we look at across the country, places that were previously classified as rural or non-metro, they've grown. And the orange dots here represent places that were reclassified as metropolitan areas. Here in Minnesota, I know the state the best. If you look, I wish I could point for you right here, but if you're looking here, right where that dark gray spot is, these counties that are around that orange little dot there, they would have easily, if you would have asked people in our major metropolitan area, where is rural Minnesota, they would have identified those places for sure. They've been reclassified. They're growing. There's a tension there about identity and what it means, but they're growing. And I guess they're no longer counted as rural places. So as we see, urban places grow wider, not taller. And our share continues to decline, but the number of people living in these places grows. Sometimes we talk about this as a total population infatuation. Like, if you're not growing, you're dying. And there's an interesting little story to be told that's happening under the radar here. If we take a long-term view, seeing The population change, this case was from 2000 to 2010, overall population across the country. And we're used to this. This is the story that there was, whenever there's a box without color, that's a population loss. You could see the places with gains. But at the same time that these population losses that we're so concerned about have been happening, there's also been a decline in the size of households on average in the United States. In 1940, the average household was about 3.6 people. In 2018, it was about 2.6. So we have less household or smaller households all across the country. What does that mean for us? There's also this myth out there that the lucky few will escape rural America, the brain drain idea. And we know that a lot of people move every day, all across the country. You know someone that has recently moved from one town to another, from a big city to a little city to wherever. It's happening almost constantly. And we were noticing that here in Minnesota and also in other places in the country. So we did something called a cohort analysis to learn more about that. And this idea is really simple, but the chart takes a little bit of explanation. So if you count the number of people in 1990 that were 0 to 4 years old, and then you count the number of people 10 years later, they'll be 10 to 14 years old, because we age at about 1 year every 365 days. So it's pretty easy pattern to follow. And if you did those counts, and there were more people 10 to 14 than there were the previous decade, your bar would go to the right. And if there were less people in that cohort, that group of people, then your bar would go to the left. And so in one county, it's a kind of a typical Western Minnesota rural county. When we did that cohort analysis in 1990, we saw partly what we would expect, that there were this brain drain, these 20 to 24-year-olds, 25 to 29-year-olds, there were less. Those people were 10 to 14, 15 to 19. This story we had heard multiple times over. You know, younger people, they leave, sure. Okay, but what was surprising when we were doing this work about 15 to 20 years ago now was this sort of box. And this box here, more 10 to 14, how did they get there? How did we get more of those folks? And this jump here of 30, 40-year-olds, 50-year-olds, what is this about? In this county, the population was flat when we looked from 1990 to 2010. The population was flat. The change, it had hardly changed. And how could that be? Well, these boxes here just weren't enough to offset for the losses. The losses here weren't enough to offset the gains. So we had flat. Think of a bathtub. If you have a drain open and a faucet going, your level might not change if they're moving at the same rate. So we saw this and we thought, that's interesting. I wonder who those folks are that are moving in. We sort of have a handle on the people that are leaving, but who are those newcomers to communities? We wanted to know. And we also wanted to know, is this just us or is this happening all across the country? And if you think about that map of population change, this was just the percent change in 30 to 34-year-olds from 1990 to 2000. And here's that same 2000 to 2010. We actually think that it slowed down a little bit. There was a thing called the Great Recession during that time. Maybe slowed things down. We're waiting to find out what it looks like with the next census numbers. We hopefully will be able to. But since we didn't want to wait too long, we've been working with other states and also here in Minnesota to research who are those folks, who are that that's a really interesting new positive story about people moving to our communities. Who are they? Why did they move? What's it all about? I've been involved in work with University of Minnesota Extension. We did a study over several years of recent movers and newcomers. We did work partnering with Nebraska to understand this. And then most recently, we replicated a study that I'll be talking more about in Montana to study Montana movers. Who are these folks? And, who are they? Well, let's talk about that. They're generally, we talk about this as a brain game. Think about this. There's 30 to 49-year-olds. I guarantee they're moving to your communities. Sometime, maybe 50 to 64-year-olds. This has been happening a long time. They're there. This is happening. It's not just, we can't just focus on high school kids leaving. There's new people moving in. What did they want? Why did they choose this? What was their story? Well, here's what we heard. Over all of these studies, it's very consistent. People they tell us, I chose to move. I wanted a simpler pace of life. I was interested in safety and security and low-cost housing. This picture here in the middle of a kid riding their bike in the street is extremely effective at conveying what it's like in many small communities. This feeling of safety. I can ride my bike in the street. I know, like I said, I grew up in a dense urban area. I couldn't ride my bike 4 blocks over. There were rules about that. You can't do that, and especially not in the street. So the kids in my town of 850 people that would seemingly roam the streets all day in the summer always was jarring to me. What else did these newcomers tell us? About a third of them said it was primarily for a job, which is also surprising. We always think it's just a job. It's not. About a quarter of them had lived there previously, so there's some returning. But think about this, 90% more had college or bachelor's degree. 75% had incomes over 50,000. 47% have children in the household, and 14% were telecommuting. That was pre-pandemic. Like I said, this is a brain game. These are people with skills, with families, with earning potential, with great interests, and new things to bring to our community. It's a good trade. We also wanted to know what sort of jobs are available across the rural economy in Minnesota. What sorts of things could you be? That's what we would ask. And this was actually just showing the jobs by industry across the Twin Cities, our big metro. Maybe you have a big metro that you think about, but also across greater Minnesota. And the point is that you could be anything. There were jobs and opportunities available in any of those categories. So sometimes we also talk about, is this really the middle of nowhere? Or maybe we're living in the middle of everywhere. Like we'll hear people say, well, I chose this community because I could get in about 45 minutes, I could get to this regional center or to that regional center down south or east, west. I could be in all these places, or I could be on the lake in 15 minutes or maybe a minute because I'm already there. Why is it the middle of nowhere? We challenge that frequently. And people will tell us, we ask them to draw maps, like, where do you live, work, and play? And they'll draw, like, I go and travel 45 minutes north for work, and maybe I play to the west or to the east. It's great, but they're in the middle of that circle. We also know, getting back to this narrative, that there are people that are interested in living in small towns. The Pew Research Center asked people in 2009, I think they did this again recently, where would you like to live? Or, what type of place would you like to live? About 20% said a rural or small town, but 51%, when we put those two together, said a small town or rural area. There's a demand for this. People are interested. It's Not everyone wants high density living. Some people do, and that's okay. But there are plenty of people. There's a market out there for you of people who are interested in living in a small community. So we encourage people to have a conversation about that future of your small town, because this narrative matters. Like the deputy governor said, your vision for the future does matter. It's not just what you had in the past. It's not just connection to nostalgia, but it's what your plan is for your future. Where is this place going? And we know in those conversations that we've had with residents across Minnesota, and also when we've surveyed them, that welcoming and creating a welcoming environment in your community is incredibly important. So just a few years ago, we did a study, a statewide survey of people who had moved in the past 3 years across Minnesota in rural counties. This is actually one of the largest studies of its kind. We did all the best practices we could to get a good sample, and we ended up with about 1,700 responses from people who had moved to their communities in the past 3 years across greater Minnesota. And this question we asked, if your community this is what people told us, is the community welcoming? And if they strongly agreed, how likely were they to live there in 5 years? Just give us your guess is what we were asking people to do. And you can see when people said the community is welcoming, 86% said they were likely to live there in 5 years. But when they strongly disagreed with that statement, we were down to 44%. Who wants to live in a place that isn't welcoming, that doesn't feel like a place you want to be in? So this is a tension that we come across, that we want to recruit folks to be in the workforce. We want to recruit new residents to live in our communities. But if we can't promise them, or if we can't pull off making them a welcoming place and engage them, they won't stay. And that's a problem. We had this great opportunity. Sometimes we miss them. So what we talk about here in Minnesota, and whenever I am talking about this in other places, is something called resident recruitment. It's not workforce recruitment. Again, not everyone's moving for a job. And it's not industrial recruitment, because, boy, I bet in any one of your towns, your employers today are saying, we have jobs, we need people. If that's not what you're hearing, I would love to hear more about that, because that would be an anomaly in my world, that people wouldn't say we have jobs, we need people, we're looking for solutions on childcare, housing, broadband. It's almost like a trifecta these days. But this idea of resident recruitment, it kind of blends community development, economic development, tourism. We'll try to put these together. We're talking about, how do we encourage people to live in our communities? What can we do? What levers do we have that we can pull in as community leaders to make that happen? And over the years and through our research, I've conducted surveys and focus groups and interviews with newcomers. I've also met and learned about the resident recruitment and welcoming initiatives all across Minnesota, and sometimes in other states. So I've seen the variety of things that communities can do. And through all of that, I'll try to give you some sense of what a plan might look like, or what a strategy might look like. And in my breakout session, I'll tell you a little bit more about this, and we'll go into more depth with some examples. So here's what I think it looks like these days. Think that your strategy will answer questions about how you will do each of the things you see listed here. But that welcoming has to be central to this, sort of like the pivot point that all of this hinges on. I think, starting from the top left, that it's important to understand. Start by trying to understand, who are those newcomers? Like I said, you saw that it's likely there are newcomers. People are moving, they're here. What are their interests? Why did they move? What helped them to choose your community? What has their experience been like when they first arrived? Did someone welcome them? Was it hard? Was it easy? How did they feel as they went through the process of trying to choose your community? Did they look at other communities along the way? Understanding those things is a great starting place. Often people want to just start at market. Let's put a billboard up. Let's clean up our website. Let's do those things. But without that understanding of who those folks are that have already chosen to live here and what opportunities there might be to improve your community or to really broadcast the great things you have, those marketing messages can be bland and miss the point. The next step really after understanding is to think about marketing. How will we get the message out? What channels are we using? We have great examples in Minnesota of people using social media, using online channels, using physical channels, talking to people, going to fairs. Like, it's all over the place. And they've been trying a lot of really interesting and amazing things to see what works. How do we get that word out? And if getting the word out is regional, that's what we hear. We need to encourage people to live in Western Minnesota. Maybe it's Southern Illinois for you. That's what we want to encourage people. We give them a sense of what that place is like. The recruitment is local, though. That's where you're answering that question. How will you help potential residents choose this place, your community? And we see things like recruitment incentives. We see things like really targeted programs for telecommuters. We see things like concierge type things, where if you're interested, you could call someone to help you decide on this community, or even the simple having a tour ready to go of your town. It's really a person by person customized approach on that recruitment side. If we're going to spend all this time working to understand and market our communities and then recruit new people, we had better spend time welcoming them, because this is critical. How will you welcome them? What is your plan? That's what we'll be talking about today, more of each of these. But what is your plan? How will you welcome newcomers? How are you doing it today? Is it working? Even if you're doing just the basics, you can ask, could we do better? And if you're not doing anything to welcome newcomers, then I have ideas for you. Once we've welcomed newcomers to the community, it's important to engage them, to make sure that they feel like they can contribute. This is a two-way street. We're glad you're here. What would you like to do? What is your dream for this community? But as we think about that future, there's a question that comes up. I hear it from people that have participated in focus groups. How long does it take for me to be? How long do I have to be a newcomer? How long does it take for me to feel like I belong here and that this is my community? So that's that next stage, is how do you cultivate this sense of belonging in your community for newcomers? And then finally, maybe the most controversial, how do you manage leaving? Everyone's going to leave eventually, but how do you make it so that people know that this is always home if you want to come back? People leave for many reasons, not just a job. Sometimes it's other opportunities or sometimes other challenges in their lives. So we have to be sure that our strategy in our community doesn't cut people off when they've chosen that they need to leave, but embraces them and tells them that they can come back. So as I start to wrap up here, I just want to tell you change is coming. About 30% of rural homeowners are 70 or older today. 75% are baby boomers and older. People will be moving. They will be leaving. They will be moving in. They'll be moving out. They'll be moving over. This change is happening right now, and it's only going to get more intense and happen more frequently. So be ready, have a plan. I think hearing from the deputy governor and the lieutenant governor, the importance of having a plan, how will we manage this, is critical. I just want to start to wrap up here by telling you that in our research and in our work, what people tell us is that they don't want to live, that they don't choose where to live or choose to move to your town based on what it was. They don't care. They don't know what store used to be in that building, who used to live in that house. It doesn't matter. They're choosing to live in your community for what you are today and what you'll be tomorrow. It's not about what you've been. It's not about what you had or what you didn't have. They see these newcomers we talk to, they see opportunities. They see their ideas with the potential to become reality in your place. And in many cases, they're right. In a small community of 850 people, a newcomer can come in and serve on city council, on an economic development authority. A newcomer can come in and lead a new effort to create a new park. These things are all possible. We're interested in anyone who's willing to contribute in our small communities. And those newcomers are welcome to. So I want to make sure I had time for questions, and so that Chris can offer any additional logistics for the rest of your day today. There's a website here that will bring you to all of our research that we've done over the years. We call it the Brain Gain. You can email me, or later on today, you can join the session where I'll talk more about this. We'll just walk through what this plan looks like, and I'll give you as many examples as I can think of what it looks like and what communities in Minnesota are doing. And I really hope that that will be an opportunity for you to share what you're doing in your community and to share with the others in the room what's happening. Because although I think that many of my examples in Minnesota are that will translate to your community, I'm sure that there are some Illinois specific things, and I want to encourage you all to share those as well. So with that, I'd just like to say thank you for having me. Thank you for listening and paying attention to this idea of changing the narrative, of looking at the positive things that are happening. And I wish you good luck in your development of recruitment and welcoming strategies for your community. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, Neil. Several questions here, if I can start. And we've seen this in Illinois as well, increasing diversity. And so, and in fact, there's been a number of articles in the Atlantic Monthly and elsewhere talking about, you know, what the Midwest needs in general and what rural communities need in particular are, we need immigrants because to counter some of that outmigration. And that's a message that I like to share. But so how do we create welcoming rural places that are welcome to diversity? So the question of diversity in our rural community development.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's probably one of the most important things that all of our communities should be working on, because they have been diversifying in a number of ways already. Like it's already happening. So I think of an example that comes from Minnesota that I'll talk about more this afternoon. It's this community of St. James, Minnesota, and St. James has really gone in the last 30 years from being about 98% white community to now there's a 30% Latino community, or 30% of that community is Latino, and primarily folks from Mexico that have moved to the community, or with Mexican heritage, really. So we had held a cohort program to address equity and welcoming in the region. And we had folks from St. James participating in that cohort. We actually had two groups of folks, some people that were representing really the white community, and another group of folks that were representing the Latino community. And they actually had separate groups, social groups, that they were there and participating. And we challenged them to just have one meeting together. And this was actually a group of retired grandmothers that played cards. And they were two separate groups. They met together, and that really turned into something amazing. and I'll talk more about this group that now exists in St. James called Uniting Cultures, where over the course of many years in getting to know each other, building relationships, they've learned how to share their stories, their visions for the future of the community, how to work together, how to cultivate the resources that they need to be successful, and really how to help each other. And I'd say, like in St. James, that example is really one of intentionality and relationship building. And so when we talk about how do we do this, it's through that. It's building relationships. It's being careful. It's making sure that this isn't something you just hope will happen.
Great, thank you. I'm going to combine two. We have about five minutes left before the 10 a.m. cutoff point, but I'm going to combine a couple of questions. Somebody made the point that sometimes planning is custodial versus transformational. So in some sense, maintaining the status quo, but maybe just burnishing it a little bit as opposed to being transformational. But then also thinking then about the idea of changing community perception. I mean, somebody early on made the point that how you are framing what's going on in rural areas as change as opposed to decline. So communities are changing, they're not necessarily declining. So that idea about transformational planning, how can that work towards changing people's perception about who they are in rural places?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm a subscriber to asset-based community development and taking an appreciative approach to this type of work. And that's what we've done. There's a program that I'll again talk a little bit more about later this afternoon that we've worked on with Nebraska and Iowa and South Dakota and North Dakota called Marketing Hometown America. And what we do in that planning process is use something maybe others are familiar with called study circles to involve people in planning for how will we recruit people? But what do we need to change to make the place more welcoming or more interesting to folks? Like that's transformational. What should we change about the community? And the difference when you take a study circle type approach, when you're empowering people, is that they come up with a whole lot of things. They don't care, what the city comp plan or the county, like they're not living within those constraints when it's the people that live there that are creating those plans. And when you ask them to think about the assets that they have, they also don't live in the decline framing. But there is an interesting thing that does happen, and that's that sometimes we have a culture of, well, can we really do this? Like we came up with this, there's a group of us, like I literally worked with a group of 100 people in a small town that came up with a plan. One small item was we need to clean up downtown. They were ready to go on a Saturday to go pick weeds. And someone had the great idea to say, well, should we ask the city manager if that's okay? And the city manager said, no, we're worried about liability to pick weeds. My response was, you have 100 people that want to go pick weeds. You should go pick weeds. Like that's sometimes what we're fighting. It's this, do we need to ask permission to do great things for our community? Sorry, that was a roundabout answer.
No, that's great. A couple of other points as we're getting close to the end. I love the idea of not just business recruitment, but resident recruitment, and something I've been talking a little bit. Full disclosure, I work for the Institution of Higher Education, but thinking about student recruitment, a place like Illinois, we're losing many of our young people from downstate and rural areas. We're losing many people to urban areas and out of state. And so, trying to think about who it is that we can retain, not just recruit, sort of applying that resident model, thinking about business retention and expansion, resident retention, and then student retention all seems to be something that we should be doing in Illinois, and I appreciate you highlighting that. Another question I had, you mentioned remote work pre-pandemic, and have you had a sense that remote, sort of the desire to have more remote working has that benefited rural communities in Minnesota?
Yeah, so we think so, and we have stories, but it's difficult right now to know how many of those are anecdotes versus a real trend. So I think so. That's my guess. That people saw the possibilities, or that really just their life circumstances, with their existing roles, allowed for this possibility, and they made the move. I would suspect the same is true in Illinois, that there were people that maybe wanted to move to a small community, but just couldn't navigate it. That, you know, the way our employment system was structured before the pandemic just didn't have as many opportunities to work remotely. So it seems like that's eased up a little bit. And in maybe the next month, we'll be releasing a survey that my colleague and I did of employees across Minnesota, asking particularly about teleworking, and both workers and employers. We saw that there have been changes when we asked employers in their policies that, I can't remember the exact percent. I think it's about 10% of the employers we asked had now added teleworking policies. And that's probably the metric I'd watch for the future. How are these policies changing with employers? If we see changes and more ability to add that, then we might see more teleworking.